All right, you ready? We're gonna start by doing something a little different. I wanna spend some time telling you a story that I hope will make a point that will lead us into the Word. So I want you to imagine with me an 8-year-old boy named Samir. Samir's name means pleasant companion. Samir has 2 sisters. One is 5 years old. Her name is Amira, which means princess, and that's exactly what she is to him. Samir prides himself on taking care of his princess of a sister. He's nothing short of a pleasant companion to her. And then there's Raja, their baby sister born a short 6 months ago. Her name means hope. Together, they lived in Syria with their father, mother, and grandmother. Samir's parents were both teachers. His dad taught Arabic in the state-run school in Syria, while his mom taught music. They worked hard to provide for their family in a quaint village of about 4,000 people. Well, it used to be quaint. Their village was situated on the border of 3 different provinces in Syria, and over recent years, it has become trapped in a triangle of terror. The Syrian army on one side, the Free Syrian army on the other side, and the Russian army in the middle. Samir vividly remembers the first time a bomb landed in his village. He was inside the house playing with a mirror when the door suddenly flew open. Samir's dad, out of breath from running home as fast as he could, started yelling, "Get out of the house." A minute later, they were huddled together in a makeshift shelter while the sound of bomb shells shot all around them. Shrapnel littered the streets, and a sure sign to these Syrian villagers that their quaint homes had suddenly become a war zone. It wasn't long until electricity was out for most of the day, schools could no longer function, work came to a halt. Food and water were both becoming scarce. Bombs would fall day and night, leaving no semblance of peace at any point for Samir or his family. Anxiety started to set in on this 8-year-old's mind with a diversity of side effects. Samir was turning into a cowering, stuttering version of himself, too scared to sleep at night, just waiting to wake up his sister and sprint with his family to the shelter at any moment. One night he overheard his parents talking. "We can't stay here anymore," his father told his mother. "We need to go somewhere else." To which Samir's mom asked the obvious question, where? For generations, their families had lived and worked in that village. Syria is all they'd ever known. Where would they go? How would they support themselves? Samir's dad shared how he had seen and heard of relocation opportunities, how if they could just get across Turkey to the Aegean Sea, they could cross over to Greece, and there they'd be free. If only they could get to Greece, then they would have passage into the rest of Europe, and they could start over. Samir's mom immediately expressed concern, saying, "Do you really think we can travel with your mom and 3 kids, including a 6-month-old baby, hundreds of miles across Syria and then Turkey? And then how do we get across the Aegean Sea to Europe?" she asked. "And who's to say they won't turn us right around when we get there?" "I don't know," Samir's dad said as he sunk into silence. But after a long pause, he spoke again. "I also don't know any other option. We either stay here and die, or we risk our lives and go." Within days, the family was packed. Everyone but the baby had a bag to carry, and just like that, generations of history and an entire family's possessions were reduced to 5 plastic sacks, one of which contained all the money Samir's mother and father had saved. They set out on foot, leaving what used to be the comforts of home behind for a journey into the unknown. It was about a 3-day trip to the Turkish border, some of it by bus, most of it by foot, in light of the various dangers associated with travel on the main roads. The first night, their family slept in an abandoned coal factory. The next night was spent in a stable. The 3rd day posed the greatest challenge, a massive mountain to cross on foot at the Turkish border, about a 9-hour trek with the sound of bullets and bombs nearby. They ran out of water about halfway through. Samir's dad was now carrying Amira. His mom was carrying Raja, the baby. Samir and his grandmother plodding along behind together, every one of them ready to quit if it weren't for others pushing them along. But they finally reached Turkey in need of rest and relief, neither of which they would find. You see, ever since refugees began trekking across Turkey, an entire industry of exploitation has begun. Refugees need simple goods: water, food, supplies for the journey to the coast, and a swath of smugglers are there to charge exorbitant prices for everything they need. Samir's dad had no choice but to pay whatever they asked to get whatever his family needed. He saw his money slipping away, yet the highest sum was still left to come. As they approached the coast, they found themselves joined by thousands of other refugees, the sea of humanity seeking asylum. Samir's dad checked his family into a hostel, humble semblance of a hotel where the family would cram into a small room with one bed. Samir's grandmother would sleep on it with the baby, while the rest of them would be side by side on the floor. As Samir nuzzled up next to his dad that night, he thought about all that he missed: his home, his friends, his life. He thought about all that he'd seen, the effects of war all around him. As tears came to his eyes, though, he took solace in the fact that he no longer heard bombs overhead. At least here they were safe. The next morning, Samir went with his dad to find a way to cross the sea. The system of smugglers here at the coast was active. It was nearly impossible to tell who you could trust and who you couldn't. So a ferry across the Aegean Sea would cost you or me about $17. But smugglers were charging refugees approximately $1,000 to $2,000 apiece for each member of a family, including infants, to cross to the other side. And they wouldn't be crossing on a ferry. They'd be crossing either on a small boat or a rubber dinghy, a raft made for about 30 people, with no guarantee that it would make it to the other side. Samir heard people telling the stories. The day before, 34 people, including 15 children and 4 toddlers, had drowned when an overcrowded boat capsized due to storms and high winds. Those 34 joined approximately 2,500 people who have died trying to get to Greece. That great sea has literally become a graveyard. The journey across the Aegean is delicate, depending on everything from weather conditions to armed criminals. Masked men on jet skis are known to attack boats, smashing into them with sticks, threatening to drown them if they won't surrender their valuables, anything they have with them. After a while, Samir and his dad met a man who said he could get them across for $1,800 apiece. $1,800 apiece. That would be over $10,000 for Samir's family. Samir's dad knew that would come close to draining his savings, but what choice did he have? The living conditions in Turkey were harsh. There's a reason people are spending their savings and risking their lives to leave that country. So Samir's dad reluctantly agreed. "I'll try to get you on a more sturdy boat," the smuggler said, "but we will see. Simply keep your phone by my side and I'll call you when it's time." Samir and his dad left the meeting with this man and immediately went to buy life jackets, never realizing their quality is so poor that many people have drowned wearing them. Once they were purchased, Samir and his dad went back to the hostel where the rest of the family was waiting. They gave them the news, told them that they needed to be ready at any time. That night, they received a call from the smuggler. "Too much rain and wind," he said. "We can't go tonight." The next night, the same message would come, and the next, and the next, and the next, until some nights a message never even came. Samir's dad began to worry if he'd made a mistake working with this particular smuggler, if passage was ever actually going to be a reality as long as they were working with him. They would pass long days in the hostel, meeting other families, sharing each other's stories, spurring on each other's hope and what might lie ahead on the other side of the sea. That hope was fading fast until one night the phone rang suddenly, and the voice of the smuggler on the other end said, "You can travel on a rubber dinghy tonight. Come to the meeting place immediately." And just like that, Samir's dad had a choice. He'd waited for weeks, hoping his family would be on a more sturdy, safe, secure boat instead of a small rubber dinghy amidst these crashing Aegean waves. Now he had minutes to decide if he was ready to risk his family's life on a dinghy. In utter exhaustion from the journey by this point, Samir's dad thought, this may be our only chance. So he looked at his family and said, "Grab your bags and life jackets, let's go." Soon, they were crammed into a small van with other refugees making their way through alleys toward a hidden crag in the sea. There, a raft built for 30 people was waiting for 60 refugees arriving in vans. They began loading the raft one by one, cramming closely in next to each other. As each of them climbed in, they were immediately cold, able to feel the freezing temperature from the water around them. One of the refugees was appointed by the smugglers to drive the boat, a task that man and nobody else on the boat had ever done. The smugglers started the engine, pushed them out to shore, and thus began the longest 3 hours of Samir's short life. Just imagine being crammed into that boat. You see the pitch black darkness. Feel the shiver of the sea as its waves toss you back and forth. Hear the sound of people screaming in fear as a man who's never driven a boat before nervously navigates the Aegean Sea with 60 lives in his hands. Samir looked over at his mom and saw fear on her face for the first time in this journey. And she clutched his baby sister tightly, knowing that if she or the baby were to fall off now, there is no way the baby would live. To make matters worse, freezing water was pouring into the boat with every passing wave, which became a major problem as they approached the coast because the raft was now completely overloaded and it was starting to sag into the sea. "Water," somebody cried. "We need to bail out this water." And they started trying to do so, but to little avail. There was too much. So another person yelled out in panic, "Wait, we need to shed more, wait." So they began throwing what little valuables they had left among them overboard. That did little to help. Something more significant was needed, and it was at that point that Samir's dad suddenly stood up. He looked into his son's eyes, then across at his wife, and he said, "I want you and everyone else on this boat to live. I'll do my best to meet you on shore." And without any further hesitation, he jumped. Samir screamed in horror as his dad, just like that, was gone. His mom, sister, grandmother wailing as well, but it was too late. The loss of weight immediately made a difference, and the raft began moving quickly toward the land. Everyone relieved except for Samir and his family as they now watched his dad disappear into the darkness of the Aegean Sea. After a time, they arrived on shore. People jumped out of the boat, their clothes quickly drenched as they all trudged ashore. For most of these refugees, shouts of jubilation suddenly filled the air. "We've made it, we're in Europe," they cried. Samir's family, however, didn't join the celebration. While others ran away from the sea, Samir and his family couldn't take their eyes off of it. Tears streamed down his mother's face as she now faced the prospect of the journey ahead, of life ahead, apart from her husband. "What do we do, Mommy?" Samir and Amira asked. Samir's mom was silent, not knowing what to say. When an aid worker suddenly came running over to them, she'd heard the story of what Samir's father had done, and she told them that there were Greek Coast Guard boats patrolling those waters. There was a chance, she said, they could find him and pick him up. So Samir's family now found themselves clinging to the sliver of hope as they came up the shore, wrapped themselves in warm blankets, and waited. They waited for an hour, then two, until a Greek Coast Guard ship radioed in and said, "The man who jumped from the rubber boat has been rescued." Not Long after that, they brought him ashore, and Samir's family's celebration could begin. But the journey wasn't over. A 40-mile walk led them to a processing center where they would wait in line for papers, for food, for water, for clothing, for everything. It didn't take long to feel more like cattle than people. But the refugee camp there was a short-term stay. Their goal was to get to the border of Macedonia as soon as possible. There, they heard, was the easiest access en route to Germany, the place where most of these refugees wanted to end up. So after a night in the camp, Samir's dad wanted them to waste no time, and the journey continued. They caught a bus to a nearby city about 52 miles south of the Macedonian border. When they arrived there, Samir's dad looked at his wife, kids, and mother, realized they did not have the energy for a 52-mile walk, so he found a taxi driver who agreed to take them to the border for the equivalent of about $300, nearly all of the family's remaining money. Hesitantly, Samir's dad gave the driver the $300. Family climbed into the taxi. 20 minutes later, though, the driver abruptly stopped and told them to get out of the car. Samir's dad protested. "I paid you to take us to the border," he said. "I gave you the money you asked us to take us to the border." The taxi driver wouldn't listen. "I'm not taking you any further," he said. "I've taken you as far as you've paid me to take you. I'll only take you farther if you pay me more." Samir's dad responded, "I can't pay you more. I don't have any more to pay you." The driver responded, "Then you and your family will have to get out." And so they did. And for the next 2 days, they trudged along, using the last pennies they had to buy small sips of water and snacks for food, until they arrived at the Macedonian border, exhausted and dehydrated. This was their destination. The destination everyone had said was the place where passage into inner Europe became a reality. But nothing could have prepared them for what they found when they arrived. The Macedonian border had just been closed a couple of days before. Passage into inner Europe was now blocked. And this refugee camp made for 2,000 people was now filled with 15,000 people. All of the established tents were taken. The only option for shelter was a thin, small tent made for 2 or 3 people for the family to set up out in the field. The tent was barely enough for the 6 of them to sit in, much less lie down. By now it was getting close to dark, so Samir went with his dad to stand in line for food, water, blankets, while his mom, sisters, and grandmother waited in the tent. The temperature was dropping. It would be a cold night. So they stood in separate lines, the dad in one and the 8-year-old son in the other. And as they stood there, the rain began to fall. Freezing rain. Relentless rain that would not stop. 2 hours later, with a couple of blankets and a portion of food, they returned to the tent, zipped it open, only to discover their entire family shivering wet as water was creeping into the tent from above and below them. Quickly, Samir and his dad crammed in, zipped the tent closed. They passed out the blankets to the girls. Samir and his dad would go without. Similarly, the food and water. It didn't take long for the meager meal to be finished. They were all exhausted, so they did their best to situate themselves to sleep, the adults propped up while the kids lay down upon them. They sat and lay there in the relative silence of the tent with cold water seeping in among them, freezing rain pelting all around them, and that's when it happened. They broke. They all broke. It started when Raja, this sweet, now 7-month-old baby girl whose name means hope, began coughing in the cold. And when Samir's dad heard the sound of his baby girl getting sick, he could no longer hold it in. As she coughed, he began to cry. Earlier, while he was waiting in line for food and water, he had heard other men talking about a new government plan to export Syrian refugees from Greece back to Turkey. Up until this point, every step of the way, he had held out hope for his family in the future. But now, crammed into this cold tent with no money to his name and no hope for a better tomorrow, nothing could hold back his tears. He wept. His wife, cuddled up next to him, followed in turn. And then his mom, and then Amira, and finally Samira. They all cried uncontrollably. As Samir's dad said over and over again to his family, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. They cried that night until they were weary from their weeping. And without another word spoken, they all fell asleep. A family with no hope for anything the morning might hold. Now, I need you to know that this is not just one true story. It is a conglomeration of different true stories. Different individuals, different families, some of whom I've met, some of whom among whom we are working. And I'd read and heard stories like this, but everything changed when I walked late at night on the Macedonian border in a sea of tents swimming in mud as freezing rain fell on them, looking at these lines of men and women standing, listening to the sounds of their children crying and their babies coughing, children the same age as my kids, men and women just like you and me, living in a semblance of hell on earth. And these are not just a few stories here or there. These are stories that are repeated over and over and over again among millions of people. And never before in history have so many people in the world been displaced, put in danger, forced from their homes. In Syria alone, 11 million people, half of the country, has either been displaced or killed. And I mention numbers like that just to show the sheer enormity of the refugee crisis that surrounds us, because I fear that on a whole, we are paying so little attention to this. Or if we do pay attention to it, we're looking at it through the lens of political punditry and partisan debates regarding whether or not we should allow a relative few refugees into our land. It is a sure sign of American self-centeredness that we have taken the suffering of millions of people and turned it into an issue that is all about us. And it's not just our country or our culture, it's the church. The way so many professing Christians today talk about refugees seems to spring from a foundation of fear, not of faith. Our thoughts and opinions flowing from a view of the world that is far more American than it is biblical, and far more concerned with the preservation of our country than it is with the accomplishment of the Great Commission. And it's that Great Commission that I want to point you to. I spend all this time telling you this story because I want you to hear that doors are open right now for the spread of the gospel in the world that have never been open. People who are open, Syrians, Afghans, Iraqis, Kurds, they're longing for hope and open to listening to the good news of Jesus Christ. One Syrian woman said to our missionary, I'm tired of being tied to a religion that doesn't offer me hope. I want to be a new person. She, her husband, and their friend all placed their faith in Christ that day and were baptized outside the camp. Two Kurdish brothers whose family had been killed by radicals in Iraq, including their parents, right in front of their eyes. They straight up said, we don't want to be Muslim anymore. We want to follow Jesus. While he was standing in line for water, a Palestinian-born man who was raised in Syria because of conflict in Palestine, so just think of his life, fleeing from conflict in Palestine, now civil war in Syria. He's separated from his wife and his children, not sure when or how in the world he will ever unite with them. But he saw our missionary distributing water, pulled him aside, and asked him two questions. One, do you speak Arabic? To which our missionary said, yes. The second question was, can you tell me how to become a Christian? I could go on and on with story after story. I got a text just the other day saying that 8 new believers were baptized in one refugee camp. But this is why I wanted to spend time sharing this story, because I want to make one truth crystal clear to you as this conference closes. Unprecedented opportunities abound right now for the spread of the gospel among people who've never heard it, if we will take them. Say that again. Unprecedented opportunities abound right now for the spread of the gospel among people who've never heard it, if we will take them. If we will refuse to retreat from mission in fear, and instead we risk our lives on mission in faith. And that's the question I want to ask us. That's the question I want to ask you right now. Are you going to retreat from mission in fear? Or are you going to risk your life on mission in faith?